Hey, it's Joe at Red's Fly Shop here. There's a really good chance you have been using the wrong strike indicator. Strike indicators are cheap and your time is very valuable, and I really want to encourage you or teach you the right strike indicator to use for various situations. I thought about trying to go fish all of these things. It would just take way too much time, but I'm going to give you the rundown on the kind of indicators that we fish and when we use them. I'm just going to show you this example right off the bat. One thing is, if you've been with a guide or you've had a guide mentor you, don't try to fish like the guide. The guides, we use boats and we cover lots of water. We fish for aggressive fish and we try to make it very easy. If you're wade fishing and you're fishing over an isolated group of fish, you're going to need to use better strategies than you would experience on a guided trip. A guided trip, we have the luxury of covering lots of water searching for aggressive trout. The first example I want to show you is just a really simple one. If I took a big strike indicator like this, that's called a thingamabobber. It's a 3/4 inch model. It's the most popular strike indicator that we sell. And I was to run a little tiny nymph like that underneath a big strike indicator. The surface currents are very swift in a river. This buoy, think about it like that, is just going to tow this weightless little nymph around. It's going to look very unnatural. You're going to have very mediocre results at best. Inversely, if I had a large fly, this indicator would make a lot of sense, because the fly's mass would have the ability to slow the indicator down and make it drift at a more reasonable pace. Again, because the fly is going to be in the bottom half of the water column where the currents are slower, and this fly is formidable enough to actually control the pace of the indicator. So that's the general principle, is indicator and fly size and weight need to correspond with one another. So if you're using the wrong indicator, you're going to get generally a very poor drift. So I'm going to start with the thingamabobber family, and then I'm going to work from big to small, and I'm going to show you an example of the fly that you would use for each indicator. And like I said, indicators are cheap and they give you a market advantage when you're on the water. So big thingamabobbers like this, that's a 1-incher. I carry these in my kit bag. I'm going to use this for extremely large nymphs. Maybe if I had one of these and some split shot fishing extremely fast water, or maybe it's dirty water conditions. Maybe the water's a little high and I want to dead drift a streamer pattern like a sculpin along cut banks. It's a great strategy for brown trout, or when rivers are elevated from rain or snowmelt. I'm going to need a big indicator like this so that when I mend or this thing sinks for a moment because a whirlpool sucks this thing down, my indicator will pop back up to the surface. I can mend it aggressively, and in those fast high water conditions, generally I don't need to worry about the fish being spooky. And if I'm in an indicator fish for steelhead with large nymphs, that's the one I'm going to use as well. 3/4 inch thingamabobber, those are our most popular size. I'm going to use that only when I'm using a larger nymph, or I'm using a nymph like this and I'm going to use the aid of split shot. And I'm going to use it in conditions where I'm probably fishing from a boat most likely. I'm frankly not going to wade fish and use this indicator system very often, but when I guide and the water's high and I'm using larger nymphs, I will do that. Moving down, this little guy right here is something I don't think we sell enough of. I think these are incredibly handy because they're a little bit less, or they're a little bit better for spooky situations, and they cast incredibly well in the wind. These are the little 1/2-inch thingamabobbers right there. And they actually play really nicely with a single nymph setup like this tungsten beaded nymph right here. I don't think enough people use a single tungsten beaded nymph with a small indicator. If it's windy and I'm fishing a nymph with like this with no weight, I'm going to run this out near the end of my tapered leader. I might have, say, 5 feet between the end of my fly line and my strike indicator. I want to keep a small indicator well away from my fly line, whereas one of these guys I'm going to keep quite close to my fly line, usually within about 24 inches, because it casts and turns over better. This is going to get a very drag-free drift. Great single nymph indicator, especially in the wind, or if it's rainy and you have a tough time managing the next couple of indicators that I show you. Like I said at the beginning of the video, don't try to fish like a Western river guide. We're using often boats and we're fishing for very aggressive fish, and we're using the strategy of covering a lot of water. Most of you are trying to improve your do-it-yourself fishing, and I applaud you for that. And I think that you really need to consider We don't sell enough of smaller indicators and yarn as well. I'm not going to go through exactly how to use this, but this is a New Zealand strike indicator toolkit. There's lots of videos that are way better than what I can do. I will tell you though, that if you look at the back, there's just a picture right there of what that looks like. In fact, there's a better one on the front. You're going to see 3 indicators there of various sizes. This allows you to use New Zealand wool and form an indicator that's the appropriate size for the job, which is very critical because your fly size is going to change throughout the day. It's wool, it's biodegradable, so if a small chunk of it flies off at some point or you trim a little bit, it's not going to hurt anything. So the New Zealand toolkit is something, do more research on that. It works really well for any of the small nymphs I have in here, from a single tungsten beaded nymph like that I showed you, all the way down to weightless nymphs, which I'll talk about in a second, that are great for a rising trout situation when there's a mayfly hatch, especially a mayfly hatch. Soft hackles like that, fished on a dead drift, imitate an emerger, in my opinion, better than anything. And when you're using those, you need to have a really little itty bitty strike indicator, and the New Zealand style system will allow you to do that. So look into that for improved wade fishing and being able to tackle a variety of situations. Maybe that's a little bit too much for you. You're like, hey, I don't want to build my own indicators. I just want this thing simple. I carry all of these in my own tackle bag, by the way. Like I said, it's not a lot of money to buy all of these and have these resources at your disposal. One thing I want to show you is yarn. So yarn is very, very useful. It's pre-built. I won't go through all the details of how to attach it to your leader, but there's a rubber O-ring right there. You just put a loop through there, pull it over. And these packs that we sell come with a few different sizes of yarn. You can also trim them to size as well. And you can run a comb through them. They actually make a comb specifically for it. I know that seems strange, but it maximizes the surface area. And this thing is more like a weightless feather. So if you think about it in terms of a feather on the surface is going to move in a natural direction. And so again, if I take a single nymph, and I really like running a single tungsten nymph below something like this, this indicator is going to sit a little bit lower in the column. It's not going to be way up top. It's not so buoyant that this nymph couldn't control where this indicator is going to go. I want the speed of this nymph, if it catches a subcurrent and it goes around the particular side of a rock, I want this nymph to be able to draw this feather or this really light indicator around the correct side so the two can work in harmony. If it's too big, something like this is going to move that nymph around and it's going to look extremely unnatural, and it doesn't detect strikes very well, to be quite honest with you. This is going to be much more sensitive, and yarn is very easy to tell when you're getting a dead drift because it sits upright on the water as well. So I think yarn is greatly underutilized. Yarn's very versatile. It comes in a variety of sizes. You can just apply some floatant to it, like a silicone-based floatant, like Luna Quell is a great program there. Now, as we get a little bit smaller, we're at the beginning of fall here. Our river's very low and clear. Hopefully you can see that behind me. We're going to get into some mayfly hatches, and the fish get very, very picky. And if you're fishing independently and you're wade fishing and you find those rising trout, a great strategy is to use a very tiny indicator. And I'm going to just show you, we have one more called Loon Tip Toppers. We sell a couple of different varieties of yarn. You can find them on the online store underneath the strike indicator category. But let's just say you're in a mayfly hatch, there's fish feeding, and you're having a challenging time getting them on dries because they're feeding just under the surface on nymphs. Those nymphs are very vulnerable when they're just under the surface. You might fish something like a small soft tackle like I showed you, or you might fish a weightless nymph like this right here and fish that just a couple inches under the surface. Take a look at that. There's no bead on it. It's very light. It's deadly when drifted correctly, but you could never put that underneath one of those big strike indicators and make it look very natural. For that, there's a couple of different sizes of these Rio Kahuna indicators. It's made for ultralight indicator fishing. There's some great videos on how to install these, but essentially I can take it, I can break off a tiny little piece of that right there, and I can make this thing 4 inches long, or I can make it 2 inches long. The nice thing is they cast extremely well, and they drift very naturally like a dry fly. This is the thick version. There's a thin version as well. The thick version might be more appropriate for like a beadhead nymph in that situation, and they cast really extremely well on lightweight rods, so they're very helpful. If that seems like a little bit too much, you could take one of these guys right here, the Pulsa pinch-on indicators. These things have been around for eons, and you could just take one of these and you basically just fold it over and put it on your line. They're very, very easy to use. Each bag comes with a whole sheet of these things, and those are helpful as well. So those are kind of indicators from top to bottom. We see a lot of people come through the store and buy product with us, and I don't think they have a really good understanding of why we would use the different indicators for different situations. Most of it equates to fly size, but it also equates to fishing conditions as well. If you're fishing on small spring creeks to a captive audience, that's a lot different than floating down a giant river like this one in a drift boat and covering 10 miles a day. So, but stealthier is better on smaller water. Smaller flies, smaller indicators is generally how we do that. So hopefully that's helpful for you. You can find all these different products at Red's. We'd love to hook you up and get you hooked up with more fish.